Hey guys, I'm Howzieky, welcome back to the channel. Last time, I implemented Breath of the Wild style bullet time in Minecraft. I was playing around with it for a bit, then I realized the only way to become airborne and trigger bullet time is to jump off of something. In Breath of the Wild, you can blast yourself into the air at will by using an ability called Revali's Gale, which really makes bullet time a lot more useful. So I decided to add it. Quick interruption, according to YouTube statistics, if I show you this graph, this number goes up. And if you click this button, I smile for the next 5 minutes. I'm a small channel still, so I notice and appreciate every subscriber. Back to adding Revali's Gale. To create an ability like this, we need a trigger and a main function. I started with testing the main function because if I can't actually make it do anything, no trigger is going to be useful. The main function in Breath of the Wild starts with lifting the player into the sky and then gently letting them down on their paraglider. Can I recreate these in Minecraft? Levitation worked pretty well before, let's try it again. For the updraft lift, let's try levitation 30. Wow, that actually works perfectly. That's the entire first half working right there. As for the second half, we need to recreate the paraglider. We can actually reuse the same gentle descent levitation 254 effect from bullet time here. And it's easier because we don't need to create particles or freeze monsters or mess with arrow velocity data. The only thing we do need is an actual paraglider. I played around with some ideas, I even considered making a custom model, but then I played around with this armor stand tool and realized that this actually kind of works. All I need to do is teleport it above the player anytime that the player is paragliding. Just one note here, in Breath of the Wild, the paraglider is automatically triggered by Revali's Gale, but you can also equip or unequip it at will while being airborne by pressing X. There's no X button that I can detect with commands, but I can detect crouching. So I set up the paraglider to equip or unequip if you're airborne and you crouch, regardless of the presence of any Gale. The main function of Revali's Gale is perfect. I made it so that it triggers when the player jumps and crouches, so it looks more like the original version. Now, putting it all together, adding particles and a Revali armor stand, here's our final result. Alright, Revali's Gale works really well. I left out a lot of the explanation, timers and gestures and stuff like that, but like a middle child, nobody cares for those anyway, me included. On to the interesting stuff. Up next, you gotta admit these arrows are boring. I'd like to implement elemental arrows. We can use potion-tipped arrows to differentiate between the different types, but there is a common theme among them all. We need to be able to detect when they hit something. This is an easy problem to solve if they hit the ground, because those arrows still exist. And to make it even easier, their data changes to say that they're in the ground. So every tick, we can just look for any arrows with the in-ground 1B tag. So it's easy to tell when an arrow hits the ground. But what about when an arrow hits a monster? That arrow immediately disappears. We can't detect a non-existent arrow. There's one common solution that I want to mention, but I won't use. Anytime there's a new arrow, summon an armor stand for it. Every tick, as the arrow flies through the air, teleport that armor stand to the arrow again. That way, we can have tons of arrows in action at once, and when one disappears, the attached armor stand will be left without an arrow to teleport to. When an armor stand has no arrow to teleport to, the nearest mob is probably the one that got hit by it. So why don't I use this? It's not precise. What if two arrows fly too close to each other? Arrow number 1 could steal arrow number 2's armor stand, and then arrow number 2 would just be a normal arrow again. Or what if a shock arrow hits a crowd of mobs and the wrong one gets electrocuted? So no, I don't like this method. There is another method, one far more accurate. Ever since 1.14 or so, one entity can ride almost any other entity. Anyone remember Hypixel's very own Herobrine Returns map? That's how they got the creepers flying on bats, or the witches stacked on top of each other. When one entity rides another, both entities are linked together so long as they both exist. So what if I make an armor stand ride every new arrow? Then, if I find an armor stand that isn't riding an arrow, that must mean that an arrow hit something. The basic idea is the same, but the key difference here is how the armor stand is following the arrow. Teleporting the armor stand to the arrow every tick is inaccurate, but if the armor stand is riding the arrow, the game handles the arrow tracking for me, so there won't be any armor stand stealing or armor stands lagging behind. The game will keep the armor stand right on top of the arrow as long as the arrow exists. When summoning an entity, you can give it a passenger with one NBT tag, so I figured that I could just modify the same NBT tag on already existing entities, namely new arrows. I thought wrong. Doing so would create a whole new entity, the armor stand, which the data command wasn't meant to do. It seems like only /summon was really meant to do that. This was a huge roadblock, but I didn't want to go back to teleporting armor stands every tick. Even just up to this point, I'd already given it a lot of thought, so I decided to make it work anyway. In for a penny, in for a pound. I decided to set it up so that every time the player shoots an arrow, I would create a copy of it. It would be identical, having the same owner, motion, location, everything. But there would be one difference. The copy was summoned with an armor stand riding it. Then I would delete the old arrow. It worked in my initial tests, but then I tested it during bullet time. This is a problem that stumped me for a while, but here's what's happening. This is the arrow's vertical velocity. The higher the value, the faster it moves upward. But if you try to set it to above 10,000, the game will just set it to 0, which means it's not moving up or down at all. The game doesn't like anything moving that fast. And considering what happens to the player when they have such a high velocity value, it makes sense. Remember how the Levitation 254 effect is broken? Quick recap. It gives the player an insanely high velocity for some reason, and that velocity is inherited by the arrow. And again, if that arrow has a velocity above 10,000, that velocity is then set to 0. Only the vertical component is ever going to be that high, so the horizontal components are left untouched. Because of this, the arrow shoots horizontally in the direction the player faces, but not up or down at all. An astute viewer might wonder why I never ran into this problem before. I had arrows moving at that insanely high velocity in the last video, and their vertical velocities never got set to 0. The answer, my pupil, is that I wasn't the one setting it to above 10,000, not directly. It was naturally gaining that value by inheriting it from the player, but when I manually copied values over from the old arrow to the new arrow that was being ridden by an armor stand, the game saw me copying values over that were way too large, and it decided that that just wasn't happening. Very interesting discovery, but I didn't arrive at that conclusion until after I'd already scrapped that whole method. I realized that the answer was under my nose the whole time. I'm already using different potion-tipped arrows for different elements. Note, when you shoot a monster with a potion-tipped arrow, that monster gains that potion effect. Why not just detect mobs that have one of the specific effects? This idea was made even better when I realized that I could customize the potion effects given by the arrows. I decided to give each of them a different level of the luck potion effect. Oh, you didn't know there was a luck effect? Of course not, nobody does. There's no way to get that effect without commands, and it literally has no effect that I'm even aware of. Which means if I set up my arrows to be luck-tipped arrows, and if a mob has the luck effect, they must have been hit with one of my customized arrows. I chose existing arrows with colors that seemed similar to the Breath of the Wild elemental arrows. For example, if my code detected a speed-tipped arrow, I'd treat it as an ice arrow because speed arrows and ice arrows are both blue. Then, if my code detects one of those arrows, remove the pre-existing effect. Remove the swirly particles. Then, add the luck effect, with ice arrows having luck level 100, fire arrows having luck level 101, and so on. All of these arrows can be the same potion effect and still be differentiable, so long as they have different levels. There's one last problem with this method. If the arrow kills the mob that it hits, then the arrow disappears and the mob disappears, and then I'll be back to having nothing to detect all over again. My solution? Set the arrow damage to 0. Then when a mob gets hit by it, subtract a few hearts from that mob's health manually. Now that we've got the elemental arrow behavior triggers working, we can do the main function, also known as the fun part. Implementing fire arrows is going to be as simple as the minds of people who for some reason pronounce especially with an X. We create flame particles as they fly through the air, and when they hit something, set them on fire. I know actual flame arrows already exist, but look at this. Compared to Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild arrows are beautiful, but look at the bottom of Minecraft flame arrows. What kind of fire is flatter than Steve's butt? I am sticking with my custom fire arrows. Now for ice arrows. We'll add some snowy ice particles as they fly through the air, and when they hit something, place a temporary ice block. We'll also want any monsters hit by one to freeze, so we'll set their no AI data to be true for a few seconds. Shock arrows. This is pretty similar in that the mobs they hit will be frozen for a bit, but we'll also make them drop the items in their hands. For the bomb arrows, we'll create fire and smoke particles as they fly through the air, and when they hit something, we'll make some boom particles, set all nearby mobs on fire, and summon a creeper with a fuse length of 0 so that it explodes instantly. And last but not least, ancient arrows. We'll give them a trail of soulfire flame particles, and when they hit something, that something needs to die instantly. But we can't just kill them normally. In Breath of the Wild, there's no death animation and there are no drops. They're vaporized. So instead of killing the mob normally, we'll throw in some particles, teleport it into the void, and then kill it. That way, it truly looks instant to the player. And with that, elemental arrows are complete. I mean, for the most part. There's still some odd quirks, like the fact that shock arrows that hit the water in Breath of the Wild electrocute everything nearby, but I'm still not sure how much interest there really is in this whole project, so I'll just worry about those smaller details if there's enough demand. Last minute edit to this video. I want to amend that statement. I'm blown away by the support that this project has gotten. 1,500 views on part 1, 250 comments across several platforms, 140 subscribers since it was uploaded, 700 total downloads, even a like from Sethling on Twitter, the guy who got me interested in redstone and commands in the first place, and more. Thank you guys so much for everything. I definitely plan to add these small details, and if you notice any that I've missed while you're testing it out, please let me know. And now, back to the video. I'm liking how this is turning out, but there's a glaring issue. I only have one champion implemented. I'm gonna need the complete set. Generally, the hard part is deciding on good gestures to trigger each one, but I'll take it one at a time. Let's start with Daruk. In Breath of the Wild, you activate Daruk's protection by holding up your shield. There's no way to detect if the player is holding up their shield in Minecraft, so I decided I'd just activate it whenever the player is crouching. So that's the trigger, now for the main function. In Breath of the Wild, it creates a cool looking shield while active, and if you get hit, it negates all damage and all knockback. Ghost Daruk also flies out and it looks sick. I don't usually get this lucky, but this is all not only possible, but easy. When Daruk's protection is active, I'll give the player resistance 100 so nothing can damage them. I'll also give them a good knockback resistance attribute value, which Mojang was kind enough to make a simple command. Working with attributes used to be a pain, so I'm really grateful for this command. It's newish and it used to be much more difficult. Now I'll wait for a time when there's a player with Daruk's protection activated and they're red from what would have been them taking damage. When that happens, we'll animate an armor stand to look like Daruk, break the particle shield, and disable Daruk's protection until the player crouches again. Now we can mark Daruk's protection off the list. Up next is Mipha. In Breath of the Wild, if you have Mipha's Grace unlocked, you're basically immortal. If you run out of health, Mipha appears as a spirit and gives you full health plus 5 gold hearts. So the question is, if I'm going to implement this in Minecraft, how do I intercept the game's native death functionality and replace it with something like Mipha's Grace? I tried detecting when the player is low on health. This works when the player gets damaged slowly, but if the player is brought from full health to 0 health in one hit, there's no way for me to intervene. So this method can't work. I got a lot of comments saying I should just retexture the Totem of Undying. I didn't like this for a few reasons. One, I want to avoid creating a texture pack for this data pack. The way I see it, survival Minecraft is basically vanilla. Commands are one step away. Resource packs are another step, and mods are a fourth step. I could do all of this easily with a mod, but I'm trying to challenge myself by staying as close to vanilla as possible. I might need to use a resource pack for runes though, because a carrot on a stick isn't too close to being a Sheikah slate, but that's a spoiler for the next video. Problem 2. The Totem of Undying does nothing unless you're holding it in your hand when you run out of health. But if you want to select an elemental arrow to shoot, you need that arrow in one hand and the bow in the other. So you would have to choose between a specific elemental arrow and an ability that's supposed to always be active. We can do better than that. So I don't want to use a resource pack to retexture the Totem of Undying. After brainstorming some more, I thought, why try to prevent the death from happening? Normally when you die, there's a "you died" screen. If you're Technoblade, this is probably your first time hearing about this. This screen would really ruin the fluid effect of Mipha's Grace. However, there's a game rule called Do Immediate Respawn that does, well, exactly what it sounds like. If it's set to true, then when you die, you immediately appear at your spawn point. You completely skip the "you died" screen. So I thought, why not wait for the player to die and immediately respawn, and then put them back where they were when they died, plus the bonus gold hearts. If I could put them back where they died quickly enough, they'd never notice any of my shenanigans and it would look nice and smooth, just like in Breath of the Wild. Small note about the gold hearts. In Breath of the Wild, Mipha gives you 5, but Minecraft only allows for multiples of 2. So I'm giving the player 4, because 4 is the number of Toy Story movies we shouldn't have gotten. And now, let's add particles and a Mipha armor stand and put it in action. Beautiful! Lastly, we have Urbosa. In Breath of the Wild, if you press and hold the attack button long enough, a sphere of electricity will appear, and when you let go of the attack button, Urbosa appears and electrocutes everything in earshot. I'll be honest, I had a lot of options for triggering this in Minecraft, and almost all of them sucked. Some people recommended holding left click, but there's no way to detect that. Others suggested right-clicking an item. This would mean holding an Urbosa item and right-clicking with it to trigger it, the same way we detect right-clicking with the bow to activate bullet time from the last video. I didn't like this either. No other champion ability requires an item, and that would make it inconsistent with not only my own system, but also the game I'm trying to replicate. The solution I stuck with was recommended by Reddit user this, who probably will never realize I credited him in this video, but hey, it was a good idea. The idea that he suggested is that I wait for the player to crouch for a few seconds, and then if the player clicks the attack button, the code triggers Urbosa's Fury. This is a great idea, but it has one issue. How do I detect left clicking? There's no way to detect left clicking, but you can detect when the player deals damage, which is just the result of the player left clicking. So, if a player crouches for so long a time that the sphere of electricity particles appear, I'll teleport an invisible mob into the player's face to guarantee that they have something that they can deal damage to. And that's the trigger. As for the main function, I'm going to animate an Urbosa armor stand just like the others and hit everything nearby with lightning. I'll also take the shock arrow electrocution function and run that on all the mobs that get hit by lightning. Now, let's try it out. Amazing! Have you ever seen such fine craftsmanship? So fine in art. Da Vinci himself would weep tears of joy at all that we've accomplished today. Well, today for you, all summer for me. And with that, all of the champion abilities are finished. Up next, we need to add runes. But at the time of this recording, only one of those are working, so that'll have to be in the next video. Subscribe to stay notified for when that comes out, and hit like so that I can have my monthly allowance of dopamine. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time.